What is going on, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome yourselves back to another video where today I figured I wanted to learn how blockers in poker work. Poker science, what's up? She kind of bad, huh? That's a bad looking lady right there. Let me get your number, girl. Oh, she like that.
Today I want to crunch some numbers on blockers. Not like NFL blockers, and not blocker bets. You know, if you have two aces, it makes it less likely your opponent has an ace, that kind of thing. But how much less likely does it make it?
All right, so I guess this is a good opportunity for me to go with what I understand as a blocker. So what I understand blockers are basically cards in which block other cards where it's less likely to have other cards. For example, aces make sense in his example. I was thinking like if it's on the board, it comes out, board has like queen, jack, 6, 7, 8s, it's less likely that somebody's gonna have an 8 or whatever. I think that's kind of so you're blocking the straight a little bit, or maybe you have, you know, hearts, 2 hearts, so it's less likely that somebody else has 2 hearts, stuff like that.
For these things. Let's look at a couple important cases and then consider an important caveat to keep in mind. Consider the case of pocket pairs. Let's say you have 10-8 of clubs, and for whatever reason, you want to know what the odds are that your opponent has pocket 10s. Well, I have good news for you. Without any other information, the fact that you have a 10 in your hand makes it half as likely that your opponent has pocket 10s as it would otherwise be. Same goes for the odds that they have pocket 8s. In general, the odds that your opponent has any pocket pair decrease by a factor of 2 if you have one of those cards locked up. But what if you just want to know if your opponent has any 10s? Well, that's a different question, so you have to be careful. In general, without taking blockers into consideration, the odds that they have at least one 10 are around 16%. If you have a 10 in your hand, this probability drops, but only to around 12%. The moral of the story is, blockers are great if you're worrying your opponent might have pocket pairs, but if you're counting on them to block a single card, you should do so with a grain of salt. But now here's the important caveat. These numbers are general probabilities, assuming that you don't have any other information, and that's rarely the case. If you have an ace in your hand, it does make it less likely that your opponent has the pocket rockets. But what if they were eagerly re-raising you pre-flop? Well, that makes it more likely they might have aces. And these two effects have to be balanced against each other, both taken into account when you determine the probabilities. To make this more concrete, consider a slightly extreme hypothetical where your opponent has 4-bet you pre-flop. And let's say that for this particular player in this situation, you're basically certain that they're only doing this with aces, kings, or ace-king. Of course, if you ever actually find a player this unbalanced, I hope you never let them leave the table. But for the purposes of the hypothetical, assume that's the case. Now you've narrowed down the range of hands they could possibly have to 28 different combinations. The 6 ways that they could have aces, the 6 ways that they could have kings, and the 16 ways that they could have ace-king. That's the situation even before we consider any blockers. So let's suppose you look down and see pocket queens. No blockers to aces or kings, but it's really important to you to try to estimate how likely it is that your opponent has one of these hands. Of course, in any general hand of poker, the odds that your opponent has aces or kings are pretty small. But in this case, because of what you know, they're around 43%. 12 possibilities out of the 28. Suppose you have ace-king yourself. In a general hand, this makes it much less likely that your opponent has aces or kings. But in this case, the probability drops only slightly, going from 43 to around 40%. That's because the information you have from your blockers is dwarfed by the information you get from knowing your opponent's 4-betting range pre-flop. This is yet another reason why, if you can, you should be thinking about the ranges of cards that your opponent can have, and thinking combinatorially instead of relying on simple rules of thumb for your probabilities, because those don't take into account the situation or the specific players that you're up against. Not all blockers are created equal, and that's especially true if you have more information to go on than just the contents of your own hand.
I got it.